who is Head of Capital Science and Policy Practice at Willis Towers Watson, the global advisory, broking, and solutions company, supporting the management, regulation, and financing of risks from climate, terrorism, cyber, and other perils. In other words, everything. Nothing is left out. Previously, he served on the board of the group's reinsurance division. And Rowan is going to be talking to us here this morning on the insurance perspective on ocean risk. How do we build resilience and transfer that risk appropriately? Rowan will be then followed by Charles Goddard, the Economist Intelligence Unit. He leads this unit. He also is the executive director of the Economists World Ocean Summit, which many of us have attended in the past, a global series of events on the sustainable use of our seas. And Charles will introduce his panel. Rowan, please.
Muchas gracias.
Con mucho gusto.
Muy bueno, fenomenal. Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, it's an incredible privilege to be the person to sort of segue the discussion into the insurance side and build on Mike McGavick's excellent motivation and framing earlier on. Obviously hats off to XL Catlin, Chip and PJ and the team, and of course the Ocean Unite team for what's been brought together here. And for the purposes of those who aren't lucky enough to come from the world of reinsurance, I just want to highlight why this is such a special gathering and in such a special place at such a special time. So the first thing is, and why, frankly, I really believe this ocean blue economy agenda is in some ways going to leapfrog the wider green climate sustainability agenda because of some of the intellectual engineering that's going to be done right at the beginning of the journey. So what excites me about this meeting is first the theme and the framing about risk and insurance. Now I know risk sounds really dull and negative, but the incredible power that we will generate by translating the value or by understanding the risks of us not taking care of these ecosystem services and wider value that the oceans bring us. By being able to translate that into the risk to economy, to legal duties of care, to capital, is absolutely transformational. And I want to share some of the journey that reinsurers have made in that and how this community can absolutely exploit that and really accelerate deliveries around SDG 14. The second reason why I'm thrilled about this meeting is the timing. The timing 2 months after the World Ocean Summit that Charles put together in Cancun. Incredible momentum, partly obviously driving from 2015 and the related agendas, Peter's appointment and other reasons, but also, frankly, a public policy revolution around the role of insurance to deliver social goods. It's a lesson that is about 300 years old. We learned it in my country in the 19th century as we urbanized, industrialized. It's been learned in many countries around the world, but for the last 50 or 60 years, it's been forgotten. But remarkably, it is as we in the OECD countries and in poorer countries struggle with all sorts of intractable challenges, this ancient institution of society called insurance, a way of understanding, managing, and sharing risk, is being reinvented. It's being reinvented in our own countries, it's being reinvented in the donor community. I'm delighted that KfW, the German Development Bank, are here. They, together with the British donors, are transforming how insurance is viewed as humanitarian and development intervention. So the timing of this meeting is remarkable. But the other remarkable thing is where we are. And it's amusing, I came on the plane from London yesterday, and we all hopped in the bus that was kindly provided by XL Catlin, and there were some reinsurance folks on the bus and some others from the wider community. And the reinsurers who didn't already live here have probably been here quite a few times before. Since 1995, my first visit, I've been here about 50 times. Meanwhile, the folks who came from the wider science world or the wider public policy world, for many, this was their first visit. And I'm sure that there were one or two of you who, when you had to get your travel requisition to come to Bermuda, might have raised a few eyebrows in your various departments, saying, no, it really is the right place to go. And it really is, not just because it's in the middle of the Atlantic and so symbolic for this meeting. It's powerful for another reason, and it's powerful for a reason of the timing. I just want to illustrate the discipline and value that this sector can bring to SDG 14 through a bit of a history lesson. And how actually in 1995 there were meetings like this in this very room, which I was lucky enough to be part of at the time, where like at this time the global potpourri and puree of a community focused on, in that case, natural disaster risk and finance, were able to come together and literally over the next 20 years changed the industry, changed the world, absolutely changed the price of risk, that 26% of those assets that are insured have been integrated into the financial system. It was this room, and what's so exciting about the timing of this meeting and the theme is that in the ocean space, we're all here in this room, or many of us are, and those who aren't are probably quite closely connected. There is the power to do incredible change from this island. So the story goes like this. There had been an insurance sector in Bermuda in the 1970s. That's where captive insurance pretty much started. There was a little bit in the 1980s. There was a liability crisis in the US, and it's actually where XL Capital, I think XL stood for excess liability, it was framed in 1986. But the transformation of what some call the romantic period of reinsurance when we had to understand nature was 1992. I remember it well because in 1992 in September I entered with a freshly minted geography postgrad degree, Lloyd's of London, to understand, to start underwriting reinsurance. I entered the market the same month that, or pretty much, that Hurricane Andrew smashed into the east coast of the US. Hurricane Andrew was the final punctuation mark in a series of catastrophic natural disasters, augmented by some other liability challenges in the States, that for the first time in 300 years brought the global insurance and reinsurance industry to its knees. For the first time, it was entirely dislocated. But people need insurance, and this is where the magic of science and regulation and capital and this island came together. So imagine it, 1992, wipeout, not just from one event, but from 6 years of unprecedented losses. Those in Britain will remember names at Lloyd's of London selling their final assets to pay the bills. But people need insurance. Prices shot up. And some investors said, you know what, things are getting worse, but they can't be that bad. And decided to establish new capacity, new capital here on this island. They had glamorous names, I remember them. Tempest Re, there was Cat Center Re, even the famous Mid-Ocean Re, established here in 1994. But the first thing that these investors said is, we are going to be smart investors. We are going to understand and embed natural disaster and climate risk in our pricing. Not by what has happened in the past, not by claims files, not by inductive reasoning, but by understanding what could have happened. And it coincided about 3 years earlier with the development of some glorified engineering consultancies in the US, one in Stanford. We've got RMS here, I think Robert Muirwood, the head of research at Risk Management Solutions, is here, who said we'll understand risk using engineering concepts, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, take history but expand it with stochastic distributions. And this capital said to these underwriters, we'll only give you the money if you use these models. It was the beginning of an analytical revolution. Using methods of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, metrics, 1 in 100-year return period, average annual loss, which were unheard of, exceedance probability curves. But slowly but surely, capital became sensitive to climate risk Not just the hazard, which of course is fundamental, but to exposed assets, populations, cash flows, the vulnerability of those particular events, the correlation around different events. Such that by 2005, when we had Rita, Katrina and Wilma, an event, or a set of events far in excess of Hurricane Andrew just 12 years before, the market creaked, but there were really no insolvencies. And since then, actually, our challenge as a sector, not that we model things perfectly, but these risks do obey the laws of physics, that we've become actually incredibly well capitalized. Such that last year's unprecedented level of losses, $125 billion of insured loss, was actually about a 1 in 10 year event, well within the frameworks of insurers. The trick was to say, make capital sensitive to risk. The final element was and I just wanted to highlight that during that period, from about 1992 to now, this sector has spent in excess of $10 billion on research and development and modelling. Some of it has been much of it focused in or through this island. And much of that some of it has been on forefront research and blue sky research, of course. I remember here at Willis, we brought about 30 scientists here on the island every year for 4 or 5 years through this research network. But most of that research has been how to translate hazard, exposure and vulnerability information into financial risk, into credit risk, into the risk that analysts worry about, into the risk that regulators worry about, creating that magical gearbox. And it's that gearbox that has allowed us to A, put a price on risk, but critically begin to put a value on resilience. What is the value of that coral reef? What is the value of that seawall? What is the value of all sorts of assets that give people protection? But the final thing that Bermuda was famous for was, or that happened, was a regulatory revolution that required for the first time insurers and reinsurers to be resilient to what could happen next year at a 1 in 200 year return period. And hold capital, albeit a small amount of capital, for that very unlikely but extreme set of events. And that was transformational. It's acted like a telescope on the tragedy horizons and required insurers to understand events which probably and their curves go far beyond 1 in 200 years, events that actually probably may not even happen for the next 100 years at all. And it's the ability to capture this range of risk and incorporate it into mainstream financing that has been so transformational. Our contention is it's some of these tools and techniques which will allow us to put a value on ocean services and ocean assets and actually create the economic logic for their resilience. So now I want to come on to insurance and what it can provide, and a few key themes. The first is, one, we have to focus not just on the long term, but we have to focus on the short term, but again, that understanding of extremes. The key requirement for communities and for companies and for governments is to truly understand what is their relationship to the ocean, what decline of resources would have an impact on them, and what is the likelihood of that decline in the short term and the long term, and account for that risk. And that's what insurers can begin to do with their tools and their techniques. The next key point I want to make is that insurance can be an organizing framework, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, or the mutual and cooperative sector. And the critical recognition is you do not have to own an asset to have an insurable interest in it. You don't have to own a coral reef to have an insurable interest in it. If that coral reef is providing you with services of protection or a value in terms of its tourism potential or whatever it might be, that gives you an opportunity to insure that asset and probably with others create a vehicle to manage, maintain and protect it. It's an incredibly powerful institution that we take to some degree for granted. the point I was talking to Her Majesty Queen Noor earlier, she wanted to highlight to me that the value that insurance can bring around creating conditions. And insurance only works if the community pot of capital that we are all contributing to one way or another is sustainable. And it's only sustainable if risk is managed within tolerable parameters, which is why usually when we take out insurance contracts or even reinsurance contracts, there are all sorts of conditions that are put on that contingent capital. We'll put locks on our doors, or we'll have the right sort of building codes. Again, by requiring certain resilience interventions or sustainable interventions through the mechanism of insurance, it can actually help us build a much deeper relationship than just a purely sort of financial transaction. So, where do I think this can probably go? I've witnessed for the last 10 years the journey of the wider sort of green finance, climate risk and sustainability journey, and it's certainly made enormous progress. But it's always felt to me intellectually unfortunate that the world of sustainability and the world of risk have been seen as two very separate communities. Actually, they need to be brought together in a very powerful intellectual fusion, because actually sustainability needs the tools of risk, and ultimately the Sustainable Development Goals are in some ways managing a set of risks for the world and society. So what excites me about this meeting, about where it's happening, and about when it's happening, is far more than just a conference. We have an ability, without some of the prejudices that can build up without knowing each other, but by coming together at the beginning of a journey, we can create a vehicle together on this island and around the world that can actually make transactions happen, which can begin to understand the role that insurers can play, both as risk managers, but also as investors, and make capital and economics sensitive to the very risks and assets that we absolutely know that the ocean is at the heart of. To my reinsurance and insurance colleagues, particularly here on this island, as Mike McGavick said, the oceans have been our business for 300 years. As we all know, about 10% of all the non-life insurance premiums that we pay around the world, that's about $500 billion worth of a $5 trillion global premium pot, forms a global community pot of reinsurance, and about half of that is focused on natural catastrophe and natural disaster protection. Most of you contribute far more to people's well-being through your insurance premiums around the world than most of us do through our charity giving. It's an incredible community product. 20 to 25 years ago, this island was at the forefront of a revolution in risk understanding that through reinsurance was propagated around the world. I absolutely contend, and I know that John Huff from the Association of Union Insurers is here, I have no doubt that if it wanted to, Bermuda, from the reinsurance side, could absolutely own SDG 14. Why not? Bermuda should make SDG 14 its own. I'm fortunate enough to be on the chair of the operating committee of the Insurance Development Forum, which is looking at how insurance can deliver to the SDGs. It would be a fabulous one focus for the Bermuda. And to undertake the revolution again that you undertook for us all took 20 years ago. The final thing I'd say is that the power of what we can do is to blend insurance and risk thinking with mainstream finance. This often really only works if investment capital is sensitive to these risks, and investment capital is being wrapped or protected by insurance and reinsurance type instruments. Again, I think this island with its asset management sector could absolutely be at the heart of this opportunity to bring capital to bear in developing and emerging economies, but wrap it appropriately. And my final observation is this. Not only 20 to 25 years ago was Bermuda a hotbed for the creation of these new markets, but it was also a hotbed for innovation around how science, analytics, indices, and data were used to create brand new financial instruments and products. In London, we have just created legislation to allow insurance-linked securities and cat bonds and resilience bonds and all the rest. Bermuda did that back in the 1990s. Bermuda can be absolutely the laboratory with our new friends and community to take these innovations through the ocean and blue economy. So for me, this is back to the future. I remember we set up a website in 1999 called Artemis, which is based here on the island, which has been a sort of a centre for some of that thinking. My goodness me, I absolutely believe that this meeting is going to be the beginning of a journey where we revolutionise risk thinking in the oceans, put a value on the ocean, and ultimately protect lives, livelihoods, and well-being for decades to come. So, my applause to Excel Catlin for all that they've done to bring us together today.